So, here's today's question. Why are Chinese imports so weak? What a stupid question, you might be shouting back. Activity in China's property market has collapsed. Property was the biggest source of domestic demand. So, clearly imports now would be weak. Yes, but also no. That story is what we should be seeing, but it isn't. Upstream commodity imports, the sort that should be getting dragged down by weakness in property construction, are actually rebounding. So rather than a senseless question, we actually have a puzzle, and one that's directly related to China's export market share grab, the issue that we discussed a couple of weeks ago. Like that, today's issue has implications not just for China, but also for other richer economies. We'll get into all of that in just a minute. Before we do, I just wanted to remind you that this is part of the research that we do at East Asia Econ. We publish a variety of reports, with something coming out on most days, covering China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and the whole region. All our research can be found on eastasiaecon.com, where you can also find hundreds of interactive and updated charts covering all aspects of macro in the region. Please get in touch if you have an interest in subscribing. With that, back to the story. As we were saying, the sharp decline in property market activity should be reducing demand for upstream construction commodities. But in fact, China's imports of these materials have been rising. This all raises at least two questions. First, why is the commodities complex not weaker? And second, if it isn't that is pushing down import demand, then what is? We'll return to the first question another time, but for the second, the answer is found in the structural changes occurring in China's manufacturing sector. As new industries develop in China, they are taking market share overseas. We delved into that process in some detail in our last report and video. The flip side to that, though, the process of import substitution, helps explain why import demand in China is currently soft. It's the weakness of imports of manufactured goods that's making the biggest contribution to the fall in overall imports. And like the export market share grab, this import substitution has big macro implications for China and for the world. So first of all, commodities imports firm, manufactured imports weak. Let's describe some of the background to this. So to be clear, first of all, while the decline in property should be affecting demand for upstream building materials, it will also clearly be dampening demand for downstream manufactured goods like household appliances. The problems in property are also contributing to broader weakness in consumer markets and consumer confidence in China, a thing that we can see reflected in retail sales. So there are substantive demand reasons to think that imports of some manufactured goods will be soft. However, it isn't apparent why manufactured imports would be so much weaker than overseas purchases of commodities. Indeed, in nominal terms, manufactured imports are now at a record low relative to GDP. Imports of primary products, on the other hand, are now at the highest level relative to GDP that they've been since 2015. Relative to China's size, imports fell in every broad category of manufacturing between 2015 and 2023. That's interesting, though China obviously was never a big importer of labour-intensive goods, so the relative fall in purchases of clothes, for example, and the like, doesn't have much broader significance. However, imports of electronics and machinery have also been falling, a development that does matter for macro in China and for macro in the broader world. The stalling in capital goods imports isn't clear at a headline level, because the one major product for which demand in China has continued to grow is semiconductors. However, excluding the chip space, and in US dollar terms, imports of machinery and electrical equipment are now no higher than they were in 2017. Analysis of narrower product categories within the broad machinery and electronics sector show that this shift isn't just in terms of the absolute headline, it's also very broad-based. Between 2019 and 2023, China's imports in US dollar terms fell in 50% of the 134 detailed machinery product categories. As a percentage of GDP, they declined in 85%. With exports also being firm, the result is a rise in manufacturing trade surplus to highs not seen since 2008. And like the decline in imports, the rise in the trade surplus is broad-based, being seen in traditional labour-intensive goods, machinery and transport equipment. China recorded a surplus in around 50% of the 134 four-digit electronic and machinery product codes in 2015 to 21. In the last 2 years, that proportion has risen to 75%. Next, we need to look into semi. Changes in Chinese demand for capital goods have direct relevance, obviously, for Japan, Korea and Taiwan, which for many years have been among the biggest suppliers of Chinese imports. China has also typically been the largest single overseas market for Asia. For Taiwan and Korea, China has also been the largest source of bilateral trade surpluses. One reason for this oversized importance of China is semiconductors. All three economies play critical roles in the global semi-supply chain. China historically has been by far the biggest destination for chip shipments from Korea and Taiwan, and it's also an important market for Japan's semiconductor manufacturing equipment makers. Now, this wouldn't seem like a great sector to be in, with all the measures that the US has sought to impose on China's access to the global supply chain. But actually, when we look at trade data across the region, it shows no real change in the direction of trade and the proportion of semiconductor exports going to China. Through the pandemic, and shipments to China actually reached record high levels. China's data show that Taiwan and Korea are continuing to supply 37% and 17% respectively of all its total semiconductor imports. The rise in semi-sales in 2020 in the pandemic was partly due to prices. The upswing then in memory prices wasn't exceptional in the cyclical history of the industry. More unusual was that the price cycle also played out in the foundry market, the segment dominated by TSMC, then is normally much more stable. That stability is now being seen again, with Taiwan's semiconductor prices holding up at the new higher level they reached during COVID. By contrast, semi prices from Korea have been falling once again and are now at record lows. Now, what's the consequences of all of this, both for the region and for the globe? First of all, it's clear that the semi-industry will have an upcycle once again, and when that happens, Korean exports will lift. But it doesn't look like the stagnation in Korean exports to China is just a cyclical phenomenon. Korea's total exports to China are now lower than at any time since mid-2010, and the US and EU have overtaken China as the biggest market for Korea, and Korea's trade surplus with China, most noticeably, has collapsed. Korea does seem to be losing market share in China's market for imports of semiconductors, but it's also losing in just about everything else. The only areas in which Korea is gaining share in China is low-end manufactured goods, commodities, and telecoms equipment. Nor is Korea making up for these losses by doing better in other markets elsewhere. The country's global market share has been falling since 2018. Its trade surplus with the US has widened, but not on a scale anywhere near to the deterioration in its balance with China. Now for Japan. Japan's trade with China has also been slipping, with exports elsewhere also flatlining, so the decline in sales to China has a bigger impact on the performance of overall exports from the country. Moreover, this looks like a real phenomenon rather than one that's nominal. BOJ data, which is probably the most robust estimate of trade volumes in the region, show that the decline in Japan's trade with China is all about quantity, not prices. Of all the Asian economies, Taiwan looks to be the only relative winner. Its semi-sales to China have held up much better than those of Korea, and it's also gaining share in other machinery markets in China. Taiwan's trade surplus with China has softened, but only modestly, and its surplus with the US has actually risen sharply. So Taiwan looks well positioned cyclically. Whether that's true structurally depends on TSMC's continued competitiveness. After all, semiconductors now account for 40% of Taiwan's total exports, up from 20% a decade ago, and most of those are being shipped to China. Taiwan's whole economy will face a major shock if and when China manages to gain more self-sufficiency in chips in the way that it seems to be doing in other machinery sectors. With this import compression broad-based, it should also be a relevant issue for the richer economies that have historically been the world's biggest producers of machinery and electronics. For the US suppliers, it obviously isn't the only issue they have to contend with when trying to do business with China. Indeed, the US's role as a supplier of capital goods to China has been visibly declining ever since the trade war broke out. That's left a gap for the EU, which outside of semis has historically been the biggest supplier of electronics and machinery to China. Perhaps surprisingly, the EU does remain a winner, being one of the few regions to be exporting more into China than it was a few years ago. However, there are some data issues, with Europe's position looking stronger in the Chinese import numbers than in statistics for EU exports. The impact of any gains also needs to be set against the much bigger lift in Chinese exports to the EU, which again is something that we covered in our last video. So, it looks like these shifts in Chinese imports are very important both for China's economy itself and for the global macro picture. And again, if you want to find out more about this, please see our whole report at eastasiaecon.com and think about subscribing. Thanks very much for listening.